Think the American Revolution was just about taxes and tea parties? Well, think again, because the real beef was about a much deeper issue. The colonists' view of their right to local self-government versus a British claim to power over them in all cases whatsoever. And James Madison later called this clash the fundamental principle on which our independence itself was declared. But he was far from alone. So on this episode, I'll explain what this is all about with a lot from James Madison, plus supporting him in this view, people like Jefferson, Hancock, Paine, and a few others. But first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for August 16th, 2024. And let's kick this off with James Madison writing in his famous report of 1800. He said the fundamental principle of the revolution was that the colonies were coordinate members with each other and with Great Britain of an empire united by a common executive sovereign, but not united by any common legislative sovereign. Mike Maharrey describes it like this. In other words, Parliament had only limited power and was not the supreme legislative authority in the colonies. We can see why the founding generation set up things the way they did in the Articles of Confederation and later in the Constitution, of course, with the foundation of the 10th Amendment behind it as well, delegating certain powers and reserving everything else to the states. Mike said from the time the first colonists arrived, this legislative authority was primarily vested in local elected bodies. And Madison said the legislative power was maintained to be as complete in each American parliament as in the British Parliament. And Maharrey points out that in practice, power was supposed to be divided between colonial assemblies and Parliament. The local legislative bodies made laws concerning things of local concern, and Parliament limited itself to legislating on issues relating to the empire as a whole, such as trade, war, and peace. But there's more to it than that, because beginning in the 1760s, that system began to change. And Mike says that Parliament set aside the constitutional precedent. Of course, this is the unwritten British Constitution, but the precedent the colonists had lived under for more than a century, and started tearing down this historic division of power with a series of acts intended to establish internal taxes and raise revenue. They also did some stuff before that as well. We'll get to that in a moment. This ramped up with the passage of the Stamp Act in 1765. And what did that all mean to the colonists? They basically viewed this as Parliament asserting that the British Empire was one unified political entity with one central government, instead of the Parliament handling kind of the external stuff and all the local things handled by the local American parliaments, as Madison described it. Mike says the colonists rejected this idea, believing the colonies were bound together under the king, but politically autonomous in most other cases. Parliament's intrusion, he writes, into issues historically left under the control of local legislatures was viewed as a usurpation of power. Usurpation is a theft of power not authorized to the government. St. George Tucker later referred to it as treason against the sovereignty of the people. And Mike says this was also a violation seen by the colonists as a violation of the unwritten British Constitution. And that's exactly how Patrick Henry put it in his Virginia Resolves against the Stamp Act in May of 1765. He said, "Resolved that the General Assembly of this colony, together with His Majesty or his substitutes, have, in their representative capacity, the only exclusive right and power to lay taxes and imposts upon the inhabitants of this colony, and that every attempt to vest such power in any other person or persons whatever than the General Assembly aforesaid is illegal, unconstitutional, and unjust, and have a manifest tendency to destroy British as well as American liberty." So Patrick Henry, maybe the original 10th Amendment guy before there was such a thing, saying that there is a very distinct line in the sand. And if you try to cross that and try to legislate for us in local concerns, you've crossed that line. And then what's the response? Well, Henry put it like this: the inhabitants of this colony are not bound to yield obedience to any law or ordinance whatever designed to impose any taxation whatsoever upon them other than the laws or ordinances of the General Assembly aforesaid. TLDR, if they go beyond the limits that they're authorized to under the British unwritten Constitution, we are not bound to obey them. You may try it, but you're going to run into a lot of resistance. Mike Meharry points out that Madison later said that the right of the people of the states to interpose against such usurpations of power, referring to 1798 and 1800, but this was based on this principle of the American Revolution, or as Madison put it, to arrest the progress of the evil, was the fundamental principle on which our independence itself was declared. Again, TLDR, there is a limit to all government power, and any acts that go beyond those limits are to be defied and resisted because they are unconstitutional, unjust, or as James Otis Jr. put it some years earlier, they're void as soon as they try to pass them. Now back to Madison. He said a denial of these principles by Great Britain and the assertion of them by America produced the Revolution. Now from there, Madison went on to make the case that even the British claim to power over external trade regulations in many situations were a departure from that unwritten British constitutional system. He put it like this. He said, there was a time indeed when an exception to the legislative separation of the several component and co-equal parts of the empire obtain a degree of acquiescence. In other words, hey, you guys still went on beyond the limits, but we thought it was pretty okay. And so we acquiesced in it. The British Parliament was allowed to regulate the trade with foreign nations and between the different parts of the empire. This was, however, mere practice without right and contrary to the true theory of the Constitution. But then, of course, the British government did, well, what governments always do. When you give them a little power, they see it as a precedent to get a little bit more power and more and more and more, and they never ever stop. And Madison described it like this. As long as this regulating power was confined to the two objects of conveniency and equity, in other words, well, we needed somebody to take care of this, and you were treating everybody equally, so everybody was cool with it. Then we acquiesced. But eventually, they went beyond that. He said it was not complained of, nor much inquired into. So no one really wrote quite a bit about this before 1765. He said, but no sooner was it perverted to the selfish views of the party assuming it, then the injured parties began to feel and to reflect. And the moment the claim to a direct and indefinite power was engrafted on the precedent of the regulating power, the whole charm was dissolved and every eye opened to the usurpation. So again, short version, they turned a blind eye to various regulations that Madison was describing as going beyond the structure of the British Constitution. And they were fine with it. But the British then expanded that to other stuff. For example, internal taxation and the Stamp Act. And then they expanded it even further. And Mike Meharry points out that in early 1766, the colonists, by that point, had effectively nullified the Stamp Act in practice and effect, and it forced Parliament to repeal the hated law. But there was a caveat. At the same time, Parliament also passed the Declaratory Act. This was 1766, asserting that it could make laws binding the American colonies in all cases whatsoever. It was a claim of absolute and unlimited centralized authority, or as Madison described it just a moment ago, a claim to a direct and indefinite power. Now, Madison, as I mentioned right at the beginning, he was far from alone in viewing things like this and referencing the Declaratory Act, this power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever, as the underlying root cause of the conflict, the clash that was the American Revolution. Here's John Hancock in his great Massacre Day oration of March 1774. He said, they have declared that they have ever had, and of right ought ever to have, full power to make laws of sufficient validity to bind the colonies in all cases whatever. They have exercised this pretended right by imposing a tax upon us without our consent. And lest we should show some reluctance at parting with our property, her fleets and armies are sent to enforce their mad pretensions. Again, short version, they claimed this power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And the way they exercised this power, one that they felt pretty closely, was the exercise of a power to tax them without their consent. That was just an example of how they claimed this unlimited power of the Declaratory Act. We also saw just later that year in 1774, the Declaration Resolves of the First Continental Congress. The very first sentence of this in October 1774 is this: whereas, since the close of the last war, this is 1763, the British Parliament, claiming a power of right to bind the people of America by statutes in all cases whatsoever, hath, in some acts, expressly imposed taxes upon them. Again, the root cause here from the Continental Congress, the first one, passed unanimously, was saying that the root cause is the Declaratory Act, and examples of how they used it were taxes, and they went through a list of a bunch of other stuff as well. Then we have the Second Continental Congress, unanimously passing the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, which was co-authored by Thomas Jefferson and John Dickinson. And because this wasn't a Declaration of Independence, it was a declaration to explain why they were fighting back. Just weeks after the shot heard around the world, Lexington and Concord, they put it this way: but why should we enumerate our injuries in detail? By one statute, it is declared that Parliament can of right make laws to bind us in all cases whatsoever. What is to defend us against so enormous, so unlimited a power? And Thomas Paine, who I cite on this pretty often, writing in The Crisis, number 1, this is December of 1776. They're struggling. It's the depths of winter. He starts it out with, these are the times that try men's souls. But he goes on in the first paragraph to say this: Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right not only to tax, but to bind us in all cases whatsoever. And if being bound in that manner is not slavery, then there is not such a thing as slavery upon earth. Even the expression is impious, for so unlimited a power can belong only to God. So Paine was really urging them to push on. These are the times that try men's souls. It may be difficult, but we can't lay down our arms at this point. We can't stop. Even if maybe we declared independence too soon, he's suggesting. Because no matter what they offer us as some kind of a deal, it's only short term. Because as long as they have this unlimited power, there is nothing that can really get us away from that except pure independence. And the year prior, well, actually a couple years earlier than Paine here, Benjamin Franklin, on September 11th in 1773, he anonymously published an essay called Rules by Which a Great Empire May be Reduced to a Small One. He used satire, a really sharp wit, as kind of an instruction manual of sorts to explain to readers how empires can come crashing down. It can take a large one and then all of a sudden ends up as a small one. And after going through all kinds of various grievances with British power, using again satire and wit to explain the American colonists' grievances, he hammered on this very same message. He said, "Unless the people should think you cannot possibly go any farther, pass another solemn declaratory act that kings, lords, and commons hath, and of right ought to have full power and authority to make statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the unrepresented provinces in all cases whatsoever." And he put "in all cases whatsoever" in all caps. It's not just email forwards that they do that on today. Been using caps for a long, long time. And he's basically saying, if you are so arrogant to have this type of an empire and you want to claim power over these people, in every situation, no matter what comes up, you're going to run into all kinds of resistance and you're going to lose that empire pretty quickly. Now, I covered Franklin's really great satire on this in an episode a few months ago, Benjamin Franklin's Rules for Bringing Down Empires. That'll be linked to in the show notes. We publish a blog post for every single episode a couple of hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/Path to Liberty. Big shout out and thanks to Alan Mosley for getting those organized for every single episode. But it actually seems like Franklin nailed it, at least according to James Madison. And here's how he described it. He said, "The assertion by Great Britain of a power to make laws for the other members of the empire in all cases whatsoever ended in the discovery that she had a right to make laws for them in no cases whatsoever. And maybe that's our silver lining for today, because eventually government does go too far. And, well, we've got a ton of work to do to get from where we are today. That is, living once again under the largest government in history, to where we want to be. That is, a real land of the free. And nothing helps us reach and teach more and more people about these essential foundational principles more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. I'd be very grateful to any consideration you can give to joining us today. You can also help us spread the word. It's free and easy peasy to smash the like button, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, subscribe, get notifications, leave comments, especially in the archives. All this stuff can trigger algorithms, especially the mainstream platforms, and tell them to show us to more people. And I really appreciate your support, whether it's financial or otherwise or all the above. Thank you so much. I do hope you enjoyed this episode, this quick take. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something that's more important than anything. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.